Welcome to Study Session 2, The Concept of Behavior. Introduction. Tunde combs his hair, drives to work, reads his book, plays his favorite song over again, and mentally calculates how many bottles of wine he will need for his upcoming party. All this could be termed as behaviors. Just like everybody, you have reasons for the way you behave. There is said to be rational and irrational forms of behavior. Why should a normal person behave irrationally? How does behavior come about? Is it learned or innate? All these questions will be addressed in this study session. Learning outcomes. At the end of this study session, you should be able to 1. Explain the term behavior. 2. Discuss how behavior comes about. 3. Identify what necessitates a particular pattern of behavior in man. Behavior. Psychology, although describing itself as the science of behavior, has not to date arrived at any consensus in the matter of what the concept of behavior means. But some psychologists have been able to come up with some definitions. Behavior can be described as a response to a stimulus. A stimulus is any event which is perceived by the human sense receptors. A stimulus could be a visual event, a sound, a taste, a touch, a smell, or any combination of these, while a response is any event or process which is elicited by or results from a stimulus. Some responses are purely reflexive, that is innate in nature. For example, when you touch a hot object, you perceive a stimulus pain and you automatically respond by withdrawing your hand. Other responses develop as a function of learning. Defining stimulus. A stimulus is any event which is perceived by the human sense receptors. For instance, when you are asked to mention the characteristics of a living thing, the response to this question have been learned. Both desirable and undesirable behaviors are learnt. A group of psychologists have defined behavior as the activity performed by the organisms, including man. This behavior may be described as the activity of human beings. Others have described behavior as a response of the neuromatter system to the environmental contingencies. This emphasizes the neurological basis of behavior. It also indicates that behavior is prompted by a number of physiological as well as environmental factors. Some of the factors outside the skin of man that may provoke behavior include needs, motives, social stimuli, and others. Some behaviorist theories. Pavlov and Skinner made findings in their experiments in the psychology of learning. Ivan P. Pavlov, 1849 to 1936, a Russian psychologist, performed some laboratory experiments about 1902 which gave some insight into the learning process. He put a piece of meat in a dog's mouth and saliva was rushing out. He collected the saliva and measured the strength of the response produced by the number of drops of saliva secreted. He then put the dog in a specially designed room which cut out extraneous stimuli and locked the dog in. Every time he wanted to feed the dog, he rang the bell, followed by presentation of the meat, which would induce salivation of the dog. He repeated this process several times and eventually concluded that the dog had learned that the sound of the bell would soon lead to it being given something to eat. The stimuli used were the sound of the bell and the meat in close sequence. After pairing the two stimuli, the saliva would flow out of the dog's mouth without the meat. He then discovered that merely striking the bell, the saliva would be produced without the meat again. Thus, conditioning has taken place. The meat stimulus that produce response without prior training is called unconditioned stimulus, US. The unconditioned response, UR, is that response elicited by US. The UR is often a highly reflective response which happens quickly and quite automatically. The saliva that the dog produced in the experiment was the unconditioned response, UR, while the striking of the bell was the conditioned stimulus, CS. B.F. Skinner's theory of operant conditioning. This is the conditioning of behavior that operates upon the environment to produce some effects. Skinner B.F. 1904, an American psychologist, suggested that learning is a series of experiences, each of which influences behavior in the same way that conditioning does. In his view, each learning experience is a stimulus that produces a behavioral response. Skinner carried out an experiment associated with conditioning. He constructed a box called Skinner box. This was a box containing a lever that released a pellet of food into a tray and at the same time automatically registered the response on a time chart. To produce operant conditioning, Skinner placed a hungry rat in the box. The inside of the box was plain except for the protrusion of the food dish beneath it. A small light bulb above the bar could be lighted at the experimenter's discretion. Left alone in the box, the rat moved about restlessly and occasionally pressed its paws upon the bar. A container with pellets of food was attached so that every time the rat pressed the bar, a pellet of food fell into the dish. The rat ate and soon pressed the bar again. The food reinforced bar pressing. The pressing response was instrumental in producing a reinforced food, which then acted as a stimulus for response. The terms instrumental learning and operant conditioning can be considered to be synonymous since both refer to strengthening and weakening of behavior by the stimulus consequences by these behaviors. Behaviorist counselors believe that if the experimental animals used by Pavlov and Skinner could be conditioned to new behavior patterns, human beings can equally be made to change their behaviors by the application of learning principles used by Pavlov and Skinner. Summary of study session. In this study session, you have learned that 1. Behavior can be described as a response to a stimulus. 2. The works of behaviorist counselors are largely based on the findings of Pavlov and Skinner in their experiments into the psychology of learning. 3. Ivan P. Pavlov, 1849 to 1936, a Russian psychologist, performed some laboratory experiments about 1902 which gave some insight into the learning process. 4. Skinner's B.F., an American psychologist, suggested that learning is a series of experiences, each of which influences behavior in the same way that conditioning does. This is the end of study session 2. Thanks for listening.